Thank you, Harvey. Beautiful, beautiful. And thank you, choir. Beautiful as well. Wonderful. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. You know, sometimes it's a challenge to be a pastor. There are a lot of factors involved in that. And one of them is simply coming up with sermons every week. And at this time, it's even more difficult because, of course, of all the factors that are going on that I don't need to tell you about. But things like the pandemic, we know that came first, and then we had all the problems, the outcry about defunding the police, about taking down statues, about protests. And my job, I think, is to bring comfort and peace and reassurance to all of you, to the congregation, to anyone who hears my word, our word, the word of God. And that's a challenge because from week to week it changes. I mean, honest to goodness, you know, you never know what's going to come up during that week. And if I pick something way in advance and start working on that, it may not be appropriate by the time we get there. So it's a different existence. Well, I'll give you a little example. A few weeks ago, dear Anna came by and she said, what's your sermon going to be on next week, Pastor? And I was sitting in my office and I didn't have a clue. I said, I don't know, Anna. I've never had that before, never had to do that before. I said, I don't know what's going to come up during the week. And I said, but I'll let you know, because she was going to plan a special music and all of that. So I went home and I was contemplating that. What am I going to speak on? And I was looking at some newspapers and things like that. And here's what I came across. It said, uncertain about your future right now? Think about that. Are you uncertain about your future in so many words right now? It says, your horoscope will guide you through this time. That's all you need. I thought, boy, okay, let me at it. Yeah, you know how long that lasted. You know how valuable those are. Anyway, that's Satan at work. Satan is always on the job. He never sleeps. But anyway, I prayed about it, thought about it, and God gave me the answer as he always does. He said something like this to me anyway. He says, have you read my book? Have you read my book, the Bible? Well, he didn't say it in those terms, but my thought was, almost every story in the Bible lends itself to peace of mind, to comfort, in one way or another. Sometimes we have to glean through that. We have to work at it. And so I went through and I picked some of the highlights of the Bible. I'm going to share those this morning with you. And I'm going to start at a wonderful place to start, which is the very beginning, the creation story and Adam and Eve and all of that, the one that we're very familiar with. And here's what it says in Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17. And this is God speaking to Adam and Eve. And here's what he says to them. He says, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden. Now, I want to stop right there and focus on that just for a minute. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden. Think about that. Wow. There's a lot of trees in the Garden of Eden. We know that. We know also that they're vegetarians at this time. They're eating solely fruit and vegetables and things like that. There's no meat in their diet. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden. But you must not eat, he says, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now, here's the question in my mind. Why don't they focus on that first part? You're free to eat from any tree in the garden. There's all kinds of trees there. But, you know, they're like children. They're like we are, aren't they? But when you say, but you'd better not eat of that tree of the knowledge of fruit and evil, what are they attracted to? Immediately. What would a child do? Oh, Mom, Dad, I can't have that. Oh, where is it? Let me at it. That's exactly what Adam and Eve do. They go to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and of course we know the story of the serpent and the apple and all of that. We don't need to go through that. But they focus on that which they cannot do. That's what happens to Adam and Eve. Maybe sometimes we do the same thing. At a time like this, we need to focus on all the benefits that God has given us, all the wonderful blessings that are out there. We need to focus on the other trees in the garden, the other trees that they could have focused on, should have focused on, that still provide fruit for us, even in a time like this. Even in the time of limitation, we know that we're quarantined and all the other things that go with this. Here's what I would say: focus on God's generosity. Focus on God's generosity, not on the restrictions that we have on us. We have so many restrictions, and they're all good. I'm not blaming any of them. I'm not criticizing any of them, because they protect us. They keep us safe. That's the first lesson I think we can learn from this simple story about Adam and Eve in the Bible. And then we go to Abraham. I always admire the story of Abraham, because this is what God says to him very early on, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. He says to Abraham, he says, "Leave your country and your people, Abraham, in your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now here's Abraham. He's 75 years of age, and he's a rich man. He's got all kinds of things around him. He's got his family and friends and everything else up in you are. And why would he want to leave a nice setting like that? Well, God has called him. So he is an obedient servant of God, and Abraham does that. He packs up his household. He gets his servants and whatever they might be, and his herds and flocks and everything else, and they head down towards Canaan. How many people would do that at that stage of life? They're not living to be 900 years old now, you know. It's a lot different in the time of Abraham. And so he's got to leave his family. He's got to take up and move all of this. And we all know what moving is. That's not fun at all. And then he gets down into Canaan, and he doesn't hear from God for a long time. God doesn't say, "Here's what I'm going to do next week or next month," Abraham. He just lets him sit there for a long time, until a famine comes along. And then God says, "You better go down to Egypt, where you can sustain yourself." So here he goes moving again. He's got to go down with his wife and family and whatever it takes, and go into the land of Egypt just to live. He's being pushed around from pillar to post. But throughout this time, Abraham never loses confidence in God. That's the important part of the story. God fulfilled his promises to Abraham, as he said he would. He made him a great nation. He prospered him. He blessed him. And those who cursed him, God cursed them. And so Abraham remained faithful to God throughout this trying time. It had to be trying when he's packed up and moved and done all the things. And here's the bottom line, I think, about Abraham. Abraham had profound faith in God. In fact, Hebrews tells us that. Hebrews chapter 11 says this, verse 8. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, meaning Canaan, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Even though he did not know where he was going. That takes faith in God to do that, doesn't it? Faith in God. So what can we learn from this story about Abraham? I would say this: Abraham was steadfast in his faith toward God, steadfast in everything he did, and supported and followed God, and believed in God, and worshiped God, so much so that he was even asked to not only go to Egypt and sacrifice there, he was asked to sacrifice his one and only son, Isaac. Take him up on the mountain, God said. And he was about to do that. He was faithful to God. So steadfastness, I would say, and fidelity to God are the main facets of Abraham. That's what we can learn from him. Let me go back to Noah. I always like the story of Noah. I think there's a lot of things we can learn from Noah. Noah is quite a fellow. I love the song, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He found favor, in other words, in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because he followed God. God was very pleased with Noah. Why? Because Noah was sort of like Enoch, I think. Enoch, walked with God. We don't know much about Enoch, but we know that he walked with God. I think Noah walked with God in that day and in that time. All around him, people were full of debauchery. They were out celebrating and doing things. But moreover, there was great violence all throughout the earth. And God said that. He says, I've looked down and I'm not happy with what's going on down there. And I don't know how to change that in so many words without changing people. And we're not robots. People weren't robots even in that time, or automatons, or whatever you want to call them. So God chose not to do that. And he finally decided, I'm going to destroy everything on the face of the earth. But I'm going to save a remnant, a few people. And Noah, because of his faithfulness to God, because he followed God, believed in God, Noah and his family were the ones that were chosen to live. We know the story about that. I don't need to go through that. Noah lived an exemplary life. And even though he knew, God told him that, hey, I'm going to send rain out there even in the desert where you live, Noah. I want you to build an ark. Now here's Noah around 600 years of age. This is back when people were living a long, long time. I want you to build an ark. Build it. It's a great big ship. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. So Noah and his sons do that day after day. They go out and build this huge vessel out in the middle of the desert. It takes them over 55, 65 years to build it. We don't know the exact time frame. Theologians think it's between 55 to 75 years that it took to build it. Probably was. Major effort, major undertaking. It's as big as many of the super tankers that we see today, the vessels that we have today. And then the rains came and the flood descended. We know the story. And God wiped out every living creature and every human being on the face of the earth, with the exception of Noah and his family. They were safe in the ark. We know the story very well. Now think about this. They're isolated in that ark for over 365 days. Over 365 days. Talk about self-isolation. That's self-isolation, isn't it? If you've got nothing but animals to keep you company. If you don't have picture puzzles, if you don't have Scrabble, think about it. That would be hard. And they didn't have any of those things. So here they are cleaning out the stalls of the animals day in and day out. The Bible tells us it went on for a total of 377 days. 377 before they found land and were able to navigate once again on the face of the earth. So what does Noah do when they land? He builds an altar to God right there with stones. Let's look at the story of Noah. Here's what's important, I think, about the story of Noah for us today. Noah was a righteous man. He was obedient to God. He was faithful to God. He displayed patience with God, and I would say, most of all, he worshiped God. Most important of all, he worshiped God, as he proved the minute he landed and got out of the ark. That took a long time. They couldn't get down for a long time. We know that story. The bottom line is Noah, like I say, Noah walked with God just like Enoch had, in a different way. And then let's look at the story of Exodus. Think about the story of Exodus. God performs a remarkable miracle. He chooses to free the Israelites, the slaves in bondage down in Egypt. And he says, I'm going to bring you up with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. I'm going to bring you up through the Sinai, and I'm going to bring you to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And in between, they're going to be out in the desert for 40 years. We know the story. Why God is training them, disciplining them, whatever you want to call it. God has purpose in everything he does. He doesn't do anything without reason and without forethought. And we know they're hungry, we know they're thirsty. God provides for them. He gives them water in the middle of the desert. He provides manna on a daily basis to feed them. Over 2 million strong. They're out there in the arid heat of the desert. And here's the important thing I think that we can remember about the Exodus, about being released from the bondage that they were in, just like we're in bondage today. We're in a type of bondage, aren't we? We have to wear the mask, we have to self-distance, we have to take extra precautions every time you touch anything. That's a kind of bondage. I would say the hymn that we sang this morning, "Great is thy faithfulness." God was faithful to the people that he brought up out of Egypt, as he said he would be. Great is thy faithfulness, O God our Father. Israel was in bondage just like we're in bondage, but it was a period thing. It was a seasonal thing, 40 years in the desert. But God was faithful. That's what we need to remember about this time. God is still faithful to us today if we're faithful to him. I just got off the phone with somebody that called. He wanted help. He's been out of work for three months. He needs help. I understand that. He doesn't even live here. He lives up in Fairfax, and he's calling us to see if we can help him financially. Now, I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that. So I said, "Have you been in church?" "No, I haven't been in church, but I call the churches. The churches have helped me in the past." I said, "Well, why don't you go to church this morning?" He's too busy calling churches. He's not going to go to church. He's just going to call around and see if he can get help. I said, "If you get in church, you'll get help." And I said, "If you don't do that, you're not going to get help." I'm sad to say. I had to be nice to him. I didn't want to alienate him. But you've got to be part of God and follow God if you expect God to help you. That's very simple. Israel was in bondage in Egypt, and God freed them from that bondage. He'll free us from this bondage that we're in. And think about Moses, the leader of this Exodus, great man. Sometimes people think Moses was hot-tempered. I think probably he was in some ways. He was impulsive and things like that, but God gave him 40 years to kind of cool down, didn't he? He sent him off to Midian. He says, just go over there. And Moses himself was in exile. Think about it that way. He was exiled from what he knew. He had grown up in the palace of the Pharaoh. And now he's in Midian, out in the fields as a shepherd. He's shepherding the flock. And that's what he's doing because God has put him there, if you will, to kind of fashion him and mold him in the type of man that he wants him to be, in the type of leader that he wants him to be. And so, of course, God appears to him in the burning bush, and we know the story of that. We know all the other surrounding factors that go with that. But what can we learn from this life of Moses? I would say this. First of all, be patient. Be patient. Why? He had no choice. When God banished him for the 40 years, he had no choice in that. And the second thing I would say that God taught him, and he, I think, picked up on this, was don't be idle. Don't sit around and do nothing. Go out and be a shepherd. It's not the same as being in the Pharaoh's palace, but do something with your hands. My father used to say that idle hands are the devil's workshop. I love that saying. They are. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. You may have heard that. And what about Joshua? Oh, one of the favorites of mine. This great man, Joshua. Joshua is kind of a hidden figure in the Bible, I think. We don't really know much about him or understand him, even though he's written a wonderful book in there. But by and large, when we look at the enormous personalities and figureheads in the Bible, we don't really focus on Joshua ordinarily. But Joshua was very faithful to God, followed God. Joshua said, "As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord." He was extremely faithful to him. But his story is a story of trial and transition, I would say. Trial and transition. And you see, God had brought the Israelites all through the wilderness. Joshua had followed Moses, who was the leader, but Joshua was second in command. He was the general that fought the battles. Moses was the overall leader, but Joshua fought the battles. And so they now come down to the land of milk and honey, the land of Canaan. And God says to Joshua, you know, Joshua, Moses, your leader, is going to die. He's not going to make it over into the land of Canaan. I need someone to lead the Israelites, and I want you to do that. Moses has been my appointed man all the way through this exile, through this journey through the desert. But now, Moses, my servant, is dead, and you must take them across the river Jordan and into the land that I will show you. Don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of you, he says, but you're the man for the job. And this is what he says to Joshua just as they're preparing to go. Now let me set the stage for you in this. In the book of Joshua, in the 3rd chapter, is where they're about to enter the land of Israel, the promised land. And they have to go across the Jordan River. The Jordan River is ordinarily about 100 feet wide. That's not very wide. 100 feet is 1/3 of a football field. Not very big at all, not very wide. It's not very deep. I've been in the Jordan River down at Jericho where they cross. It's not that deep. They do baptisms down there, for example. And that's during ordinary times. But this time, when they're about to cross the Jordan, this is the harvest season, it tells us in chapter 3. And during the harvest season, when the crops are coming in, the Jordan floods. And I mean, it really floods. It gets wide. Some people have said it gets even up to almost a mile wide. So that's wide, and that's deep. The Jordan River. And that's the way it was when they come to the Jordan River. And this is what God says to Joshua as they come up to this raging, frothing river, the River Jordan at this time. He says, God says this, he says, this is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. In other words, all those are tribes that are living currently in the land of Egypt, land of Canaan. And I'm going to take care of those, Joshua. You don't have to worry about that. Now, when you go in, you're going to have to do battle with them, but I will be with you. Don't worry. But then he goes on, God goes on and says, see, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. I'm going to go first. Don't worry about it, Joshua. I'm going to go in the form and in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. You know what the Ark of the Covenant is. That's symbolic of God himself. That's something that you don't touch. If you touch, you'll fall over dead. God has proven that. And so he says, I'm going to put that in front of you. I'm going to lead your army and your men and all the people of Israel as they enter the land of Canaan. So here's continuation of that. It says, so when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark, now this is the way they did it, the priests carried it. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. Praise the Lord. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, that's the Dead Sea down below in southern, was completely cut off. What a mighty God we serve. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, just like crossing the Red Sea. God did the same thing as when they crossed the Red Sea to get up out of Egypt. He's repeating that miracle in a different way. While all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. He holds back the waters. God can hold back the waters anytime he chooses. He can hold back anything He can hold back this pandemic when he chooses, and that'll happen. That'll come. We don't know when it'll happen. If we're obedient to him, if we follow him, I would say this is the lesson to be learned from all of this. Let God go first. Let him go first. He knows what he's doing. We don't. We're not as smart as it's just like I tell Linda all the time. She's a lot smarter than I am. I know that. You all know that. I don't have to tell you that. But that's all true. God is smarter than we are. And just like Joshua, we know that someday Jesus will lead us to the promised land, to that promised land that we're looking for. Let me close with David. David is an interesting fellow all the way through. But David is running most of his life, it seems, from either Saul, you know, who was the king that was in power when David went out and killed the giant, Goliath. But you see, the people loved David. Why? Because he killed Goliath. Why? Because David was a wonderful psalmist. He wrote psalms. He was very talented, very gifted. And so the people said this about him. It says in 1 Samuel 18, it says, they sang, that's the people of Israel, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. He was a great general as well, you see. Saul was very angry, and this refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get me but the kingdom? What more can he get but the kingdom? In other words, he's out to take my kingdom away. I don't like this guy, David. Saul didn't like him at all. He tried to have him killed. He says, David, I want you to go out and bring back evidence that you've killed 100 Philistines. He knew the Philistines were warlike people. David goes out and kills 200 Philistines, brings back the evidence that he's killed them. Saul says, why don't you marry my daughter? He's thinking he'll get him in that way. David says, no, don't think so. Thank you very much, but I don't think I'll do that. David is running all his formative years from Saul. You've heard that, you've read that. He hides in caves, he has to flee time and again. And then when David becomes king and you think everything is settled down, he has a son by the name of Absalom. And Absalom is a ne'er-do-well, I'm sad to say. But Absalom is one also who wants to take the kingdom away from David. He doesn't like David. He feels like he's not an adequate father, and perhaps there was some truth in that. We don't know. But nonetheless, he tries to overthrow David. He becomes a judge first. And then he has himself crowned king. He flees to Hebron, and he has himself crowned king. And he puts together an army. And then he chases David out of Jerusalem. And again, David is fleeing for his life. Well, once again, God intervenes. And of course, we know this story. Absalom is riding through the forest, and he gets his hair, he's got long hair, gets that caught up in a tree, in the tree branches. And Joab, the general that's in charge of David's army, comes along and sees him there in the tree branches and impales him, kills him. And David is heartbroken. Why? Because he loved his son Absalom, even all the bad things that he had done and tried to do to David. So nonetheless, David is still heartbroken and says that in Scripture time and time again. But here's the bottom line. David was a man after God's own heart. We know that. That's the important part. David was a man after God's own heart. Even though he sinned, even though he was like us, David had a lot of warts and things and freckles and whatever they might be. But here's the bottom line I would say about David. I would say just like David, we have to put our trust in God. David always trusted God, prayed to God, wrote psalms to God, wrote beautiful psalms to God. We see them in the Bible. And he put his trust and confidence in God. That's what we have to do. So let me give you just a brief recap here of what I think each one of these stories tells us today. First of all, let me talk about Adam and Eve. What can we learn from them? I think we need to remember that God is generous in everything he does. We need to focus on his generosity and not on the restrictions that we have today, even though we have them. Noah, I think we need to focus on his righteousness and obedience and the fact that he had patience and that he worshiped God. Noah. What about Abraham? I would say his steadfastness and his fidelity to God were the outstanding attributes, things that we need to have as well. The Exodus story, I would say we need to remember that God freed them from bondage, the bondage they were in. He will free us from this bondage. We don't know when, but it will come. Moses, I would say, be patient. Moses was patient. Be patient and don't sit idly by during this time. Use your hands, use whatever resources you have. Joshua, just as God led Joshua and the Israelites into the promised land, let God lead you today. He'll lead you wherever you want to go, as long as it fits in with his will and with his plan. And David, what can we learn from David? I would say simply trust in God. That's what David did. Trust and obey, for there's no better way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. That's where I think the story of the Bible comes in, and I think where it applies to, and there's so many other stories I could go on and on, but as you know, but the Bible tells us, it gives us good examples of people who were patient even during times like this. This is the time that we come to in every service when I invite anyone who wishes to come and give your heart, soul, and life to Jesus Christ. If you wish to rededicate your life, or if you wish to pass your letter, whatever it might be, we're going to stand and sing a closing piece here, a closing hymn. I would invite you to come forward at this time if you wish, and as we stand and sing.